and I want to read this to you. If I'm just talking about myself, there's no value in that. Romans 12:5 and 6. So we being many are one body in Christ and individually members of one another. Having then gifts differing according to the grace that is given to us, let us use them. Prophecy, let us prophesy in proportion to our faith. But we got a lot of different giftings within the larger church, right? I'm just curious. I mean, I think I know. How many of you are preachers that are here today? Yeah, there's several of us. Okay. How many of you have your favorite preacher that anything he writes or says, you want to hear it? Yeah. And how many of you have your less than favorite preacher? It seems like everything he says, I've heard that before, or I said that better, right? Here's what we as preachers need to understand. Every one of us is somebody's favorite preacher, but we're not everybody's favorite preacher, right? We're just not. And it used to bother me when folks would visit my church and then join your church. My goodness, why would they do? Because guess what? I'm my favorite preacher. You know, for 30 years I've been pastoring, and for 30, I do keep some of my notes now for writing projects, but for 30 years I purposefully threw all of my notes in the trash after I preached them because I wanted a fresh word every week. God blessed in that, but what happened was I was getting a fresh word from God every week, and so I thought that was the best thing in the world. But everybody else, you know, it's so. So here's the deal with us preachers, and here's why I love that passage about our various giftings. But then he says, do it in proportion to your faith. That's important. I don't know if you know this about we preachers. We come equipped with an ego as a part of our standard package, right? And some of us have gotten good to wrap that up in humility, but we're pretty proud of our humility, right? And so that's, and by the way, God has shaped us to be the tools he wants us to be. I work with some orthopedic surgeons down in Central America a lot, and I don't know if you've ever tried to lead a bunch of orthopedic surgeons. It's like herding cats, right? Because there is a certain ego. Some of you have heard me say, there's a certain ego that makes someone say, hey, I can cut you open and make you better, right? And that's the ego I want when I'm on the operating table. But there's a certain ego that says, hey, I know how to fix your soul, and I know it's God's word. So God creates us with that, okay? But you better learn to control all of that. So what do I need to tell you today? I loved God from a very, very, very young age. There was never a question of if, but when. I was really a Samuel type of kid. I was baptized at 7, and that scares me to death when parents bring a 7-year-old to me now, and I say, oh, wait, slow down. In fact, I go to Samuel and said, look, you know what Eli's advice was? Go back to bed. If God's speaking, we'll hear from him, you know. But I know what I know. I know that I came to the Lord at that age. And I love the Lord. And I will tell you this, my parents, my two most vivid memories from childhood. Every morning I woke up early, and my mom was studying her Bible at the kitchen table. Not reading it, studying it. And every night when I went to bed, I walked by their bedroom and I saw my dad on his knees at the foot of his bed. So I grew up, I'm Baptist. You know this about Baptists. There are Southern Baptists, there are Missionary Baptists, there are Free Will Baptists, there are Hard Shell Baptists. You know about all of those? I grew up with the mean Baptist, right? You know who those guys are, right? I mean, we loved Jesus a whole lot more than the rest of you people, and we were mad about it. That's who we were, okay? And but we love the Lord. But it just, you don't have to be so angry about it. But I grew up in that setting, little church, and I was the little Samuel of the church, and everyone said, hey, you're going to grow up and pastor a big church, and you're going to do this. And all these folks in my life said, you're going to do this big thing. And guess what? I could then wrap up my own ego in a spiritual blanket. Well, my spiritual mentor said I need to do this. Right? You see how that happens? And by the way, I'm not mean about growing up with the mean Baptist. I love those people, and I learned some things from those. These are my people, and I learned a couple of things I learned from them. One is it's not about you, and two, truth doesn't care about your feelings, right? I mean, truth is truth and doesn't matter. That's important stuff. And so I grew up with all these guys saying, well, you're going to go and do this, and you're going to grow and do that big thing or that deal or the other. And those of you that are pastors, I tell people sometimes, if I hadn't made someone angry this week, I'm probably not doing my job. I'm not trying to make them angry. It's just the reality is that we're all called to disagree with a lot of people, but we're called to love all people, right? And so how do you do that in a loving way? And so here's what happened for me. Here was my path. My ego said, hey, you've got to go do this big thing. You got to do this big. And all my mentors were saying, you got to go to do this big thing. And God kept calling me to small things. And he would shut the door on the big things, or he just made it clear that that's not what you're supposed to be doing. It worries me within our denomination, because every time a pastor goes somewhere, well, he's called there, but it seems like God always calls him to a bigger church or more money, right? And by the way, God can do that, and there is something too, as you grow in your shepherding, God puts you in those other pastors, absolutely. And there is a blessing to, listen, every area has its anchor churches, and those anchor churches can be a blessing or a curse to the rest of the churches in the community. And there's a real ministry to that. And I just thought, well, that's what I'm supposed to do. And God just kept calling me to smaller and smaller things. Small, big things is what he called me to. And so I was thinking about, for example, in college, my spiritual mentor was big on the speaker circuit, and he'd say, hey, come fly with me. I'm going to be speaking in Alabama or Florida. I would go, and he'd make a big deal of me. That was big stuff for a college kid. Oh, wow, that's what I'm going to do. That's not what God had for me. And then I'm in the youth ministry, and I was like, I'm going to do the youth speaker circuit. And boy, one summer of that, 12 weeks of youth camp, and I knew that was not my calling, right? And big churches somewhere would call and say, hey, you need to come. And God would say, no, that's not for you. I thought that I was going to do, and I have done missions. I thought I was going to do missions, and so I thought that meant African, so I wouldn't date anybody in college because I didn't want to bring a family into that situation. And then God brought Danielle along, and God and Danielle had different plans, and praise God for that. It's the best thing that ever happened to me. And she kind of told me why. She said, well, are you so arrogant that you think that God can't call me to do whatever he's calling you? So anyway, so God called me into missions as a pastor. And every church I've served has given me permission to do that, has understood that call in my life. But then so I thought that was the deal. And then there was, back 30 years ago when I first started this, radio was a big deal, and I'm pastoring this little church, and all of a sudden I'm doing this radio thing, and people, oh, I know you, you're doing, I'm like, oh, this is the big thing. And by the way, that was the most miserable, to do a 15-minute slot. That meant you sat in a little closet for a couple of hours and recorded 15 minutes of looking at a wall. And I pretty quickly knew that's not my calling, right? That's not what I'm supposed to do. And then, I was pastoring a little country church, and a church called me Palm Beach, Florida. Oh, big money church. And it was the big columns. It was sitting across, literally looking out at the Gulf. Big money. That's what I'm supposed to do. And I got to talking to the guys, and we're getting serious about it. And I had 3 small kids, and we're getting serious. And I said, okay, well, come on down. He said, I'm a realtor. Let me help you find something. He said, what do you live in now? I said, I live in 5 acres and 2,500 square foot just outside of San Antonio. He said, oh, great, I can put you in a 700 square foot apartment. And I had 3 small kids, and I heard from God really quickly, that's not what I'm called to do, right? I mean, you can't put 3 small kids in that. And God kept moving me into, so the big city. So I go to Houston, and I pastored, and this was good ministry, but basically I pastored a NASA church. It was NASA astronauts, engineers. NASA engineers do not walk by faith. I have discovered that. Okay, those guys, it's triple redundancy. But that was great ministry, and God called me to Kilgore, which has been great ministry. I pastor Mayberry. It's a pretty good big. Okay, but I just kept noticing God kept calling me to these. Here's an example of how He'd call you to those big, small things. But first, when I finished up seminary and I didn't want to go back to school, and God started saying, hey, you need to go back and get your doctorate. I was not a good student. I did not want to do that. And we are driving, my wife and I are driving from San Antonio up to Arkansas to meet up with her parents. And she's asleep in the passenger seat, and all along I'm arguing with God. Well, I'm not going back to school. And this is the days before everybody had computers, okay? They were not ubiquitous. And so I put all these stipulations. I said, well, God, if I'm going to go back to school, I have to be in New Orleans, and I'm not in New Orleans. And I'm going to have a computer, and I don't have a computer. And my wife woke up, and I said, well, you're not going to believe what God's telling me. But these are the stipulations. She just laughed and didn't say a word. I kid you not. We drive up to Arkansas. We get out of the car. My father-in-law walks out and says, hey, we're buying new computers at school. Do you want one? Oh, my goodness. And I said, well, sure, but I still, it's got to be New Orleans. And the next day, a school, my wife's a school teacher, a school in Lafayette, Louisiana, the principal called her and gave her a job that she did not apply for. And she said, well, I'm not, he said, it's yours. I'll see you in the fall. And so I had to go to my church and say, hey, I'm resigning into the summer, going back to school. They said, well, what church are you going? I don't know. And that sounded really weird. That was a Sunday night, and Monday morning a church in Lafayette called me and said, hey, we want you to be our pastor. So I'm like, okay, well, God's up to something. This is big. So I get this. She has to start school in September. My position doesn't start for a couple of months. And so I've got a few months on my hand. I don't want to sit around the house. I want to work, but I don't want to take a job. And so I had a buddy that had a oil field temp service company. And he said, well, why don't you just come work? I said, sure, that'd be great. I'll go to work for you. I don't know if you know about oil field temp service companies, but I was the only person without a legal record on that work crew, okay? I was it. And so here for 3 months, here was my job. I'm sitting in a pipe yard in August in Lafayette, Louisiana, swinging an 8-pound sledgehammer, tightening these giant bolts with a sled wrench. And day 1, that sounded romantic and heroic. And day 2, I was sore and hot. And day 3, I'm like, God, I got a master's degree in theology. Why am I doing this? And by the way, the answer doesn't come day 4. 2 weeks later, the guy I'm working with, who is a convict, okay, he looks up to me and says, so what do you do for a living? I said, I swing a sledgehammer. And he just laughed. He said, no, you don't. And I thought I'd been doing good. He said, no, you don't. I said, I'm a pastor. My new church is starting up in a month or 2. I'm a pastor. And he dropped his sledgehammer. He said, I'm a convict. I said, oh, yeah, I know that. He said, I was saved in prison. I said, really? He said, I've been praying for a pastor. I said, really? He said, but I don't feel comfortable walking into any church. Guess what? My congregation of 1 right there. Okay? And so God kept calling me to these smaller, big callings. Does that make sense? And I began to realize, it's not about all those other. And so he continued to do that. And so he begins to put in my life this oddball cast of characters that had nothing to do with me, okay? And so, yes, serving a NASA church. There were these astronauts and this and that, all these weird things. But there were these other people that God started putting into my life. There were authors and journalists and academics, and I had a militant atheist guy who said, "Hey, you're my pastor." I said, "Well, how's that going to work?" And because we argued all the time, he said, "Well, you're my pastor." Uh, and then he started showing up at my church. Okay, and so you work with that. Right when internet became a thing, before there was such a thing as internet influencers or whatever, I was like, okay, I'm going to experiment with this. And I got big into Facebook, because Facebook was a big deal then. And all of a sudden, I get this weird mix of people, atheists, lesbians, Muslims, this, that, virulently anti-Christian people, and I'm kind of their internet pastor. Some of them were saved, many of them were not. Okay, and so about time that starts to get big, and influencer becomes a thing. God says, okay, that's not what I've called you to be a local pastor. This is detracting, and so again he pulls me away from that, and we move on. I'm trying to think of some of these. He just started putting these groups of people in my life. There is a lapsed Irish Boston Catholic guy who's mad at God, and guess what? He tells me I'm his pastor. Okay. I speak to him daily. There's a group of guys, mostly journalists and academics. We speak on a daily basis. Boston, New York, London, Washington, D.C., L.A., and Kilgore, Texas. And most of them are saying, well, we're kind of trying to figure out, what in the world are you people in Middle America thinking? What? I'm kind of their subversive friend. These kind of these Ivy League academics, they sit in the faculty lounge and say, "Oh, I know one of those evangelical pastors in Texas." I'm kind of their subversive friend there. But God began to, it just places me in those spots while I'm pastoring in little Kilgore, Texas. Bob Glauber, you don't know Bob, and Bob has since passed away. Bob was Undersecretary to the Treasury under Bush. He was the FINRA chair. He was all these high, all of these things. But to get his personality, he was on the board of directors for the Metropolitan Opera in New York. Okay, so he's very kind of stiff, Bob comes down to Kilgore, Texas, and spends a week with me. And again, I've just passed. Bob goes back to New York, and I get a phone call from one of our Jewish friends a couple of weeks later. He said, "What did you do to Bob?" What do you mean, what did I do to him? He said, "What? He's different. What did you do to?" I said, "I didn't do anything to Bob." I said, "What's wrong with Bob?" He said, "He's a hugger. He hugs he's a hugging fool all of a sudden." Well, he'd come to South, he came to Texas, and he took some of that off. But the reason I tell you all these silly, weird stories about that, they're a young 20-something-year-old Rhodes Scholar student, gorgeous young lady. She decided, "Hey, your family's my family. Will you be my parents?" I'm like, "Sure." She is in a lesbian relationship with a Spanish hotel owner in Morocco. And we're always butting heads because I with love, but I share the truth with her, and she'll go away for months at a time and not come back, and then she's going to say, "I don't know, I don't get it with you Christian people. There's all this love, but all of this structure." And I was like, "Well, yes, that's the way it works." But the point I want to get at with all of this weird group of people, after 9/11, I'm in Houston. We thought it'd be a good idea to do simulcast. Here's what Muslims believe, and here's how you evangelize them. And so I just told my people and said, hey, come Sunday night, we're going to do this. The next day, the imam calls me. He said, we're kind of offended that you're doing that. I said, well, let's go have lunch. So we went to have lunch, and I said, look, of course we disagree on things, but I said, why don't you come? So Sunday night at my church, he comes, and several hundred of his Muslim congregation come, and so there's all these Baptists and all these Muslims. This is within a few months after 9/11, and they're just staring at each other. And then the simulcast come up, and it's how to win your Muslim friends to Christ. And it is an apologetic on all the wrong things Muslim, and for an hour that goes, and we're all just staring, watching this. And at about halfway through, it gets dark, and about a third of the Muslim men, leave the room. But they went out to pray, and then they came back in. And so after 2 hours of this, how to win your Muslim friends to Christ, I never thought I'd call on a Muslim imam in a Baptist church. It is a tense silence. And it finishes, and I said, I looked at the imam, I said, look, we're not going to preach a sermon here, but did they misrepresent you and your beliefs? And he was very appreciative. He said, yeah, this thing and that thing. And that was great. And so we have several hundred Muslims, several hundred Baptists staring at each other, and instead of me saying anything, I said, look, you've been sitting here for 2 hours staring at each other. Have you guys ever talked to each other in your life? And a little Muslim lady said, no, I've seen these people in the grocery store. We've never spoken to each other. I said, well, you got a lot to talk about. How about you guys just talk? And for another 2 hours, the Baptists and the Muslims sat there talking about their faith with each other. And so I became the Baptist from central casting for all these interfaith denominational, and I didn't want to do that because those interfaith meetings and conversations go nowhere. But I had a couple of missionaries that said, no, we want you to do that. They said, the main thing's not what's going on stage. It's we're meeting people in the audience, okay? And you do these interfaith dialogues, and all of these other Christian groups would try and soft pedal, and they would ask me in the mosque, said, no, the Bible's clear. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and life. That is the only way. And all the Christian guys on the panel would go, I can't believe you said that. And all the Muslim guys would say, thank you. We know what you believe. We have no idea what these other guys believe. And so you just speak into that. And I guess the reason I tell you all of those things, the guys from my church will laugh because there was this Italian film crew that shows up at First Baptist Kilgore. And I was like, okay, well, y'all just be kind of nondiscreet, just kind of hide. And they are so obvious. They're out there going all over. It's just disturbing the whole service. And so then they call me and they say, hey, there's a new pope. He said, we're doing this article for this national magazine in Italy. What do you think about that? Why does Italy care what an evangelical pastor in Texas thinks about the new pope, right? God has given me this weird menagerie of folks. And here's what I'm beginning to realize. I am not everybody's cup of tea. I'm not everybody in Kilgore's cup of tea. I'm not everybody in First Baptist Kilgore's cup of tea. Okay? I am not. But when God gives you a seat at a table, take it. Okay? These Ivy League guys, there's not a lot of Christian gospel seats at that table. And by the way, if you're going to sit at that table, you have to accept, initially they think you're a bumpkin from Texas who doesn't know what he's talking about. Just go with it. Greater is he who is in you than he who is in the world. Would you just put yourself at whatever table he has set you at and be God's presence there? And so that's really the, again, I didn't know where to go with this, but, testimony. That's what I've discovered. Here's the projects I'm working on now. And by the way, I always need laborers for the harvest. We're in Honduras. We're doing water filters. For $30, I can give a family clean water for life. And by the way, it's not with a machine that the local water Nazi has control over. Each family gets their own. And if you broke your water filter, it's $30. I'll get you another one. But we give those to pastors in remote areas, and the pastor becomes the expert on fixing the water filter. So guess what? The pastor's in the home. And so one young pastor, he had 12 members. It was a little village, about 200 people. I said, well, let's give you a filter for everyone in your village. I went back to visit him a year later. He said, now I have 80 people in my church. Because it's living water and water, clean water. And so we're doing that. And I'm working in these very remote, most of these villages, I'm the first Anglo these guys have ever met in person. And I'm working, and that's what God's called me to. And I'm doing all that, and I'm praying for Honduras, and God says, stop praying. Well, God never says stop praying, so I kept praying, right? And God says, stop. God doesn't tell me to stop. And God basically yells at me, stop. I said, God, why would you tell me to stop praying for Honduras? He said, you can't pray for the nation if you're not planning for the nation. You're planning for a couple of villages. Well, I don't have the resources. Well, that's not my problem, And so it changed our strategy in Honduras. Instead of local, and we said, okay, well, how do we get these filters nationally? Well, a few weeks later, the president of the AG convention called and said, hey, we want to distribute water filters. Great. A few weeks later, the Baptist called and said, hey, we got a seminary in Tagus that needs to be restarted. I don't have the resources to do that. And we delayed and delayed because we don't have that. But by the way, we're starting that seminary now with the Baptists, and we're doing the water filters. We went down this summer, we expected 60 pastors. We're hoping we would get 60. 160 showed up from Mexico, from Peru, from Honduras, and from Nicaragua. I don't know if you know what's going on with the church in Nicaragua, but these guys are losing, having their church members killed. And what was amazing is, when North Americans go into Central America, they always want your resources, we met with the pastors and I said, what do you need? They said, training. We don't need your money. My denomination spends all this time training Anglos to go to Central America. They don't know the culture, to try and be a pastor there. And God has his men there in that country ready to pastor that just need training. So we started a seminary. And then locally there's this, the other project outside, American Exchange Project, which is not a Christian organization. It's basically came out of the Ivy League, a bunch of blue state liberal guys were very concerned about the divide in our country. And one of them said, hey, I know this Baptist preacher in Texas. Surely he knows what. So, and it's a simple thing. We're sending high school students. If you're from a blue state, we send you to a red state. If you're from a red state, we send you to blue state. And my red state friends, I'll say, oh, I don't want to send my kid. Listen, you've equipped them with the gospel. They're ready for this. They're going to get it in college in the next semester anyway. So if you're from a city, we send you to the country. If you're in the country, we send you to the city for a week. So this summer, if you're going to come to Kilgore, Texas to find out about Texas, church is a big part of that. So we had a Muslim, we had a Baha'i, we had a Mormon, lots of atheists. All those guys sat in church with us this summer. And then, by the way, I hear from those guys. A little Baha'i girl. David had the choir in Washington, D.C. She was doing an internship with one of the, and she called and said, hey, I see y'all are in Washington, D.C. Let's go have lunch. And some of those folks have been saved, some have not, but we're speaking into those lives. By the way, we need more folks in that. I need a chapter in Longview. I need a chapter. If you want to help out with any of that, I need pastors to go with me to Honduras or churches to do water filters. I need all of that, but That's not what I'm here to tell you today, though I'll be happy to hook you up with that. What I'm here to tell you today, and it took too long to say it, is if God gave you a seat at a table, take it and be his presence at that table. It's not about the numbers, the this or that. Who does God put in front of me at the time, and how do I be God's presence in that person's life?